let's touch grass and talk about Western Europe, and also why CollegeBoard keeps asking about women. And no, it's not like that math meme where you tell someone to stop asking to find their ex and don't ask why. Anyway, post-classical Western Europe is one of the best case studies for understanding why historians work so hard to recover voices that earlier historians overlooked, including those of women. Now, I'm a lady myself, and I'm not some rabid, self-hating misogynist. The thing is, AP World asks about women a lot. The 2023 DBQ focused on Muslim women challenging traditional gender roles. The 2026 DBQ asked about how 20th century wars changed women's roles in society. That's 2 DBQs in 5 years, and that's not even counting the other section questions. The focus on women isn't because CollegeBoard is trying to ignore everyone else. It's because, for centuries, history was mostly written by men about men. Contemporary historians have spent the last 50 years trying to recover the voices that got left out. There's still this weird idea that there's history and then there's women's history, as if women somehow existed outside of history. But if we only pay attention to one group's experiences, we end up treating white, male, European history as though it's representative of everyone's history, instead of just one part of it. No shade against white, male Europeans. Sorry, guys. So, today, instead of only looking at knights, kings, and popes, let's look at the women whose lives help us understand what post-classical European society actually looked like. First things first, the rules. Post-classical Europe loved rules. Kings had rules, like the super important Magna Carta. In England, rebellious nobles forced King John to accept the Magna Carta, which put into writing that even the king had to obey the law. Now, let's not get carried away and pretend this instantly created modern democracy. It didn't. Its protections mainly applied to free men, especially nobles. But it helped establish the much bigger principle that royal authority had limits and that rules existed for a reason. Knights, who were basically the soldiers and military power of kings and nobles, were also chained by rules, outlined in their code of chivalry. So not only did they have to follow the laws of the country, they also had to keep their behavior in line with their ever-evolving, unwritten code of ethics, which, controlled everything from how to treat women, to how to demonstrate proper deference and loyalty to their lords, to how, actually, fighting and dying on the battlefield actually was a proper way for them to get to heaven. The Catholic Church also had rules. So very, very many rules. I am certain you can imagine. And women of all statuses most definitely had rules. Society was built around feudalism, where everybody supposedly knew their place, and obedience was rewarded through protection. Kings ruled, noble lords managed land, knights fought, serfs farmed, and women? Well, according to the ideal version, they were supposed to marry, pop out babies, raise the babies, run the household, and politely let men handle all the important decisions. Which, well, it's certainly a division of labor. It's called traditional because societies repeatedly idealized this division of labor, not because every household actually functioned that neatly. Because, reality has a way of making things messy. Imagine your boss leaves for 6 whole months and says, "Don't worry, my spouse will run the company while I'm gone." Well, that's basically what happened all the time in post-classical Europe. Feudal lords spent months or years fighting wars like the Crusades, Reconquista, the 100 Years' War, a few civil wars and peasant uprisings, and the growing threat of the Ottomans and the whispers of the Mongols. If they weren't fighting in one of those things, they also had duties like attending court, which meant staying by the king's side for weeks or months to further their political agendas. Oh yeah, can't forget, travel. Moving from one city to another could take days or weeks, and military travel could even mean even longer travel times. So, sometimes there was a huge husband-shaped absence in the castles and castle towns. Still, somebody had to collect rent, somebody had to settle disputes, somebody had to manage the servants, somebody had to keep the textbooks. So who got to do those things? If you guessed the lady of the manor, congratulations! You can pick up context clues. Good on you. Noblewomen often became the acting CEOs of enormous estates whenever their husbands disappeared. Did they officially rule? Usually no. Did they actually keep the whole place functioning? Absolutely. One woman who exemplified this, and who isn't discussed nearly enough, was Joanna I of Naples. Now, based on whatever documents you're reading, or where you're from, you can call her Joan, Joanna, or Giovanna. Regardless of what you call her, she was super cool. Her grandfather, King Roberto the Wise, on his deathbed, named her his sole heir. That was already unusual enough to make half of Europe start arguing over whether her husband should receive the real authority. Joanna's answer was basically, no thank you. The only catch was that there was a council of regents who couldn't actually do anything because the council couldn't actually get control of the government. So teenage Joanna entered a royal court where everybody had authority on paper, but nobody seemed capable of using it. She had 4 catastrophic marriages, and somehow nearly every marriage came with enough political baggage to require its own international conference. Unfortunately, she didn't have any children who outlived her either. In her first marriage, she repeatedly refused to give Andrew of Hungary co-ruling status until he was murdered under mysterious circumstances. Ooh. She fled to Avignon to negotiate with the Pope, to clear herself of involvement in Andrew's murder, to secure approval for her next marriage, and to prepare to retake Naples. Somewhere inside that political target run, she also sold Avignon to the papacy for 80,000 florins, which, think maybe around $10.5 million today. So, regardless of all of this, Joanna was still haunted by whispers of conspiracy and murder for the rest of her life. Anyway, in between ruling and dealing with political and real battlefields, Joanna ended up getting married 3 more times due to them conveniently dying on her. Lucky husband number 4 managed to outlive her, though. One recurring problem was that every husband seemed to think marrying the queen came with a buy one marriage, get one free kingdom promotion. Joanna politely informed them that it did not. She negotiated marriage contracts and political arrangements that limited their actual ability to govern. Joanna herself handled day-to-day ruling, approving laws, protecting local businesses, encouraging new industries, reducing crime, and, so on. In other words, every time a man married her expecting to gain the title of king and gain actual governing power, she essentially laughed and said, hell no. During the Western Schism, in which several people claimed to be the true pope and fought over power, Joanna backed the Avignon Pope Clement VII instead of the Roman Pope Urban VI. The Roman Pope declared her a heretic and stripped her of her kingdom, giving her rival Charles of Durazzo a justification to invade. She was captured and later murdered in prison in 1382. A sad end to a cool lady who ruled for almost 40 years in a society that kept telling women to get back in the kitchen. Now, suppose marriage wasn't your thing. Okay, congratulations! Post-classical Europe actually had another career path. Become a nun. Now, before you picture everyone silently praying 24 hours a day, post-classical convents were basically businesses. They owned land, managed finances, educated children, copied books by hand, ran hospitals, and, oh yeah, did all the normal prayer stuff. A nunnery could sometimes have dozens or even hundreds of people. One of the few places where a woman could officially lead an institution was inside the church. So an abbess, or the lady in charge of a nunnery, had an officially recognized leadership role, which gave her a clearer institutional claim to authority than, Joanna often enjoyed in marriage. Now, there weren't a ton of famous nuns or abbesses during this time period, but there were a lot of famous mystics, or women that spread spiritual messages or completed spiritual tasks. They were also called mystics as not every religious woman entered a nunnery. One of those famous mystics included Joan of Arc, who started off as an illiterate child of French farmers and rose to inspire troops, participate in campaigns, and eventually became politically important to King Charles VII's cause. Another mystic was Margery Kempe. She married, had 14 children, traveled on pilgrimage all the way to Santiago de Compostela and Jerusalem, cried loudly enough to become locally famous, and thrown in jail overnight, and also dictated what is often considered the first autobiography written in English. While there were plenty of famous women, they all had the common experience of being told to stay in their lane. Christine de Pizan wrote one of Europe's earliest defenses of women. Catherine of Siena publicly criticized the Pope, and so on and so forth. Of course, most women were peasants whose work kept farms, households, markets, and textile production running. And they rarely left behind biographies dramatic enough to survive. But were women powerless? No. Were they equal to men? Also no. Yeah, post-classical Europe is messy, and women usually exercised power indirectly. So, TLDR. How did women navigate post-classical European society? They did this by managing households, aka feudal economics, leading religious communities, aka the church, and occasionally ignoring society's expectations altogether. Post-classical Europe was a story of women constantly finding ways to exercise power inside of a system that tried to limit it. Today's AP tip is about eliminating wrong answers from multiple choice questions. There are usually 3 to 5 options to choose from. One of them is often easy to eliminate because it's historically inaccurate. Yes, some of you out there are self-hating and saying you'd never recognize it, but honestly, they make these wrong answers fairly obvious. So if you know something, you'd probably be able to eliminate this particular wrong answer. On to the next wrong answer. Another answer choice might sound really convincing, but it'll sneak in one extra detail that the source never actually supports, or that is, again, not quite right for the time period or civilization. That one little addition is often enough able to make the whole answer wrong. If your last 2 answer choices both seem correct, ask yourself, which answer is best supported by the evidence the source actually gives me? AP World doesn't usually reward the most true answer. It rewards the answer that's best supported by the evidence in front of you. And if there isn't a source, just ask yourself which answer best answers what is actually being asked. All right, that's enough grass for today. We're headed home. Peace.